Hi, welcome back to Human Emotion. So we know that some people seem to have full control over their emotions, right? Whereas other people seem to have literally no control over their emotional reactions. So what does this mean? Are there really differences in the way that we try to harness or control our emotions? And what should we call this field? This field that talks about emotions as not just passively happening to us, but as things that we can either really clamp down and rein in, or ones that seem to sort of take over our lives. So, in other words, think about this example here. Imagine standing in line at a supermarket counter. A grumpy clerk slowly passes each item on the scanner, glaring at you. A small child behind you emits a piercing scream. Your blood pressure rises and your fingers grip the cart tightly. But at that very moment, the thought crosses your mind that a scathing remark towards the clerk or the child will make things worse. So you bite your tongue and put on a smile. Why? So these more sort of quotidian acts of what we think of as emotion regulation constitute a really important fabric of civilization. So there's many circumstances in our lives that require that we don't just express our emotions as we're feeling them, but that we actually have to sort of regulate, control, or even change our emotions in the sort of blink of an eye. But why do people regulate their emotions, and why are some people very good at it, where other people seem to have more trouble reining in their emotions? And are some ways of regulating emotions more successful than others? Do people differ in the strategies or ways we try to control our emotions? So these are some of the questions that we're going to try to cover today as we really think about this idea of precisely how and when we try to take the reins over our emotions and direct and navigate them through life where we want to go. So today, we're going to start our first module on emotion regulation. So this is an introduction to the idea and the central question of, can we actually control our feelings? So the roadmap today is going to go as follows. What I want us to first do is really try to delve in and understand what emotion regulation is, what is the definition of emotion regulation, and what are conceptual models of emotion regulation that have been proposed. So we'll go through this slowly and carefully, followed by our takeaway questions and expert interview. So let's start here with asking ourselves, what exactly is emotion regulation? What does it mean to try to shift, to lever, or literally change the emotions that we're experiencing? So here I draw from the wise words of really the father of emotion regulation, James Gross, who is a professor at Stanford University and pioneer in this field of emotion regulation. So you can see here, he defined emotion regulation as the processes by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express their emotions. So this here is perhaps the most commonly used definition of emotion regulation and the working definition that we'll be following today in our class. So when we think about emotion regulation, I like to think of it being broadly divided into a 2x2 grid. We have positive and negative emotions here, and we can either down-regulate them, decrease their emotion intensity, or up-regulate them and sort of, leverage up or amplify the feelings we have. And this then leaves us with a quadrant of 4 squares. We can decrease our positive emotions, we can decrease our negative emotions. We can also increase our positive emotions or increase our negative emotions as well. And so when we think about emotion regulation then, there's really one of the most famous models of how we regulate our emotions called the process model of emotion regulation, proposed by James Gross and followed up in subsequent work with colleagues. So this model begins with a timeline here that you can see at the bottom. And this is supposed to represent the time course of an emotional response unfolding over time. And he speaks about sort of 3 main points in this temporal course of emotion regulation that suggests when you might regulate your emotion and different strategies to do that. So the first here is what you can see is he first begins a sequence, what I have in pink here, with what's called an event or stimulus. So this is a psychologically relevant situation. The situation can often be external, like standing in a line at a grocery checkout line that we talked about at the beginning of our class today. But it can also be internal, perhaps thinking of an emotional memory or thought. But the important point here in this process model is that this is the time point before an emotion occurs that gives rise or triggers the emotional response. So when it comes to regulating your emotions here, the focus at this point is to engage in strategies that will preemptively put you in a position to either experience more or less emotion. And so as you can see here, this is what Gross refers to as antecedent-focused strategies. And I'm now going to define these more in detail. So when we think of antecedent-focused strategies, there's two main categories that come to mind. The first is what is called situation selection. So this is taking actions that will make it more or less likely that you'll end up in a situation giving rise to either desirable or undesirable emotions. So if we use the example from the beginning of the class, this would be simply moving to a different checkout line at the grocery store so as to avoid the whining child altogether. There's also situation modification. So this is directly modifying a situation so as to alter its emotional impact. So here you could instead try to strike up a friendly conversation with the grocery clerk. So both of these, you're shifting or modulating the situation you're in that's going to change how you're feeling. In this case, try to feel less negative emotion and perhaps more positive emotion. If we go back to the process model of emotion, this second component you saw in yellow is referred to as the assessment of the event. So here, this refers to the ways that you can regulate an emotion once it's already occurred, right? Or during the emotional experience itself. And this includes two different kinds of regulation strategies, which have been referred to as attentional deployment and cognitive reappraisal, or changing the way you think about or construe the situation. So again, I'll walk you through definitions and examples of these types of regulation strategies. So here, when we think about the assessment of the event, we'll start with as a strategy of attentional deployment. And this can either be distraction or concentration, really focusing your attention towards or away a given situation. So in other words, you're directing your attention within a given situation in order to influence your emotions. So you might try to, in this frustrating situation of being at the checkout line, try to divert your attention to remembering a happy memory, right? Sort of put your cognitive focus on something else that's going to shift your emotional state to feel less negative and more positive. You can also, as the bottom row indicates here, engage in what's called cognitive reappraisal, or a sense of cognitive change. This is really at the heart of cognitive behavioral therapies and involves changing the way that one appraises, that is, thinks about or evaluates a situation in order to alter its emotional impact. So an example, again, in our instance of being in the grocery line, is to think that the situation you're in could actually be worse than it is, right? Which it could. And you could have, instead of one screaming kid, you could have 10 screaming kids behind you in line. And so that's one way to try to put things in perspective. Another way to reappraise the situation is thinking, you know, this situation is temporary and it will pass. There's many different ways that we try to, it's basically cognitively reconstruct, reinvent the way we're thinking about the world around us, because it's often thought, especially in cognitive behavioral therapies, that the way we think about the world is what often leads to our emotional responses. So if we can shift the way that we appraise or evaluate the world, we'll then influence or shift our downstream emotional responses. So finally, in this process model of emotion regulation, we have here on the far right in green what are called response-focused strategies. So these are also strategies that occur really once the emotion is full-blown and you need to then find a way to modulate it or shift it. And the most common strategy talked about thus far in the literature in this domain is what's called suppression or behavioral suppression. So the definition here is essentially inhibiting whatever ongoing emotion expressions you have or shaping your outward display of emotionally expressive behavior. So as we learned earlier in class, part of an emotional response includes manifesting these displays in the face. And we talked about the facial action coding system and the prototypical emotion displays that go along with feeling angry or sad or happy or fearful. What suppression is saying as a strategy is to really shift your expression outwardly, and as a result, shift the way that you're feeling or shift the way that you're going to emotionally navigate that situation. So here, again, thinking about this, sense of anger as you're waiting in the checkout line, you just want to get through, you just want to go home. One example would be to try to suppress that anger expression, to try to mask it as much as possible by either putting on a neutral countenance or maybe even trying to smile as a way to shift how you're feeling and sort of get through that particular situation in the most adaptive way possible. So here, this is the full process model of emotion regulation. And again, think about it as sort of moving along with time, starting from the situation, antecedent focus, to cognitively assessing the event through attentional employment or cognitive reappraisal. And then once the emotion is really online, focusing on ways to change your response, so a more response-focused approach. The two strategies that have been most widely studied here to date have been cognitive reappraisal as a putatively adaptive strategy, and suppression often talked about in terms of a more maladaptive strategy. And we'll get to the empirical evidence behind these strategies in our second module on emotion regulation. The point I want to make important here is that this temporal process of emotion regulation is recursive. And by recursive, what I mean here is that emotional responses at the far right can and often do change a situation, which can give rise to an entirely new situation and subsequent emotions that would arise and need to be regulated, as you can see through the arrow in that graph. So this has been a brief introduction first to give you a foundation into what is emotion regulation and what is a process model by James Gross that's been widely used in the field to conceptualize how we understand when, why, and where emotion regulation occurs. And we'll follow this up in our next module by covering some of the existing empirical evidence behind this model. What I want to move now then to are our takeaway questions for today. So the first question for today asks, what is the definition of emotion regulation provided by James Gross? And from his process model, what is an antecedent-focused emotion regulation strategy? So can you define it and provide examples? And also, what is a response-focused emotion regulation strategy? Also, can you define it and provide examples? So what I want to do now is turn to our expert interview for today. This is part of our Experts in Emotion interview series. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. James Gross from Stanford University on emotion regulation. Dr. James Gross is a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He received his BA in philosophy and psychology from Yale University and PhD in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley, with subsequent postdoctoral training at the UC San Francisco. Dr. Gross is widely regarded as the pioneer in the field of emotion regulation, and his work has received numerous awards, including Early Career Awards from the Society for Psychophysiological Research, an Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association, Outstanding Young Researcher Award from the Western Psychological Association, and countless teaching awards, such as an award for teaching excellence at Stanford University, such as the Walter J. Goris Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and a postdoctoral mentoring award from Stanford University. His work has been supported by numerous grants from the NIMH, NSF, the NIDA, among others. He's also published over 200 papers and edited the authoritative handbook of emotion regulation. So I now turn to our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. James Gross. So there's many circumstances in our lives that require that we don't just express our emotions as we're feeling them, but that we actually have to sort of regulate, control, or even change our emotions in the sort of blink of an eye. But why do people regulate their emotions, and why are some people very good at it, where other people seem to have more trouble reining in their emotions? And are some ways of regulation just passively happening to us, but as things that we can either really clamp down and rein in, or ones that seem to sort of take over our lives? So, in other words, think about this example here. Imagine standing in line at a supermarket counter. A grumpy clerk slowly passes each item on the scanner, glaring at you. A small child behind you emits a piercing scream. your blood pressure regulating emotions more successful than others? Do people differ in the strategies or ways we try to control our emotions? So these are some of the questions that we're going to try to cover today as we really think about this idea of precisely how and when we try to take the reins over our emotions and direct and navigate them through life where we want to go. So today we're going to start our first module. Hi, welcome back to Human Emotion. So we know that some people seem to have full control over their emotions, right? Whereas other people seem to have literally no control over their emotional reactions. So what does this mean? Are there really differences in the way that we try to harness or control our emotions? And what should we call this field? This field that talks about emotions as not rises and your fingers grip the cart tightly. But at that very moment, the thought crosses your mind that a scathing remark towards the clerk or the child will make things worse. So you bite your tongue and put on a smile. Why? So these more sort of quotidian acts of what we think of as emotion regulation constitute a really important fabric of civilization.